9. Moral weakness in high places. The exodus of the colored people from the South still attracts attention. President Hayes wrote in his diary on May 25, 1879. The effect is altogether favorable. Fed up with limited employment opportunities, with humiliation and terror, with the overall social, economic, and political oppression, waves of black Southerners packed their bags and headed west. Most made for Kansas with its abundant, cheap land. Kansas, where John Brown had joined in the fight to keep its slavery free when it was a territory. For these people, called exodusters, Kansas was Canaan, the promised land. One of the movement's leaders was Benjamin "Pap" Singleton of Nashville, Tennessee, a slender man with an iron will, motivated by a grand dream of his people living truly free and independent. Frustrated over the sky-high prices white people wanted to charge black people for good farmland in Tennessee, back in 1873, Singleton made a trip to Kansas. He liked what he saw. He soon led some 300 residents of Nashville to Cherokee County in southeastern Kansas. There, in 1877, he established Singleton's Colony. Old Pap, as he liked to be called, a man said to have full, quick eyes and a general expression of honesty, courage, and modesty, passionately promoted moving to sunny Kansas. He did this through speeches at emigration rallies where people sang songs such as "The Land That Gives Birth to Freedom," and through a lot of print advertising. In Kansas, there was abundant room for all good citizens, said one flyer, but no room for loafers. Hundreds more black people, most from Tennessee and Kentucky, took a chance on sunny Kansas. And 5 years after Singleton's colony was settled, there were 2 more black settlements. One was Dunlap in eastern Kansas's Neosho Valley. By the end of 1878, 200 families had purchased 7,500 acres of public land and built homes, a school, and 2 churches. The other colony was Nicodemus in northwestern Kansas. Nicodemus was not so hardy in 1878, but would soon build up. Singleton would later claim that he personally recruited a little under 7,500 black people to Kansas. His reach was far greater, however, thanks to reports of black successes in Kansas and his flyers that blanketed the southern states. In the spring of 1879, what had once been a trickle became a flood. Thousands and thousands of black people left Louisiana, Mississippi, and other southern states. "The white people in Louisiana are better armed and equipped now than during the war," the formerly enslaved William Morrell to a Senate committee. The exodus prompted Congress to launch an investigation in which more than 150 black and white people were interviewed. In the spring of 1879, stated an 1880 Senate report, thousands of colored people, unable longer to endure the intolerable hardships, injustice, and suffering inflicted upon them by a class of Democrats in the South, had, in utter despair, fled panic-stricken from their homes and sought protection among strangers in a strange land. The report spoke of people thronging the wharves of St. Louis, crowding the steamers on the Mississippi River, and in pitiable destitution throwing themselves upon the charity of Kansas. Indeed, many of the people joining in the exodus were not as prepared as Singleton's followers had been. Thousands more were congregating along the banks of the Mississippi River, hailing the passing steamers and imploring them for a passage to the land of freedom, where the rights of citizens are respected and honest toil rewarded by honest compensation. Union Army veteran Henry Adams was among the black people the Senate committee interviewed. Adams, born into slavery in Newton County, Georgia, lived in Louisiana for most of his life. A community organizer, in 1870 he spearheaded the creation of the Colonization Council, a group of black men. The council, which eventually included about 500 members, convinced that it was utterly impossible to live with the whites of Louisiana, petitioned then-President Grant to relocate African American people, possibly to Liberia in West Africa. In 1877, the council asked the same of President Hayes. When nothing came of these requests, Henry Adams turned his gaze toward Kansas. When Adams went before that Senate committee, He handed over his notes on black misery in Louisiana, observations made while traveling around the state on fact-finding missions. While Pap Singleton and Henry Adams urged on the migration, a number of prominent black people opposed it, most notably Frederick Douglass. By then, Douglass was living in Washington, D.C., on a 15-acre estate, Cedar Hill, across the Anacostia River in Uniontown, later renamed Anacostia. At a time when hope was hard to come by, Douglass argued that black Southerners needed to remain where they were living in the South. In a paper he submitted to a September 1879 convention in Saratoga Springs, New York, Douglass said this: "Not only is the South the best locality for the Negro on the ground of his political powers and possibilities, but it is best for him as a field of labor. He is there, as he is nowhere else, an absolute necessity." Another esteemed black person who opposed the migration of exodusters was a man also born into slavery, Blanche K. Bruce, then a U.S. Senator for Mississippi, whose wealth included a 640-acre plantation in Floryville, Mississippi. Bruce bristled at how haphazard the exodus had become. It sprung, he said, out of a passion rather than a performance, a passion pursued impulsively and thoughtlessly, depending upon luck and charity rather than preparation. Despite the warnings, African Americans continued to go west. Between 1870 and 1880, Kansas's black population alone rose from roughly 16,250 to a little over 43,000. The vast majority of black people, however, remained in the South, where their ancestors had been enslaved. So many black families toiled as sharecroppers. Under this system, they rented farmland and worked it, agreeing to pay for its use by giving the landowner, in Mississippi for example, typically 30 to 50% of their cotton crop at the end of the year. What's more, under disadvantageous crop lien arrangements, they had to purchase everything they needed, tools to food, from the landowner's store, pledging to pay for those goods at the end of the year out of the money earned from their share of the crop. In addition to charging inflated prices for goods, the landowner kept the account books. When accounts were settled, most sharecroppers had little or nothing to show for their year of hard work. Many, in fact, began the new year in debt, still owing the landowner money for expenses incurred over the previous year. This was the vicious circle of the sharecropping economy. Year to year, sharecropping meant children not attending school because their labor was needed in the fields. It meant contending with a wide range of health risks and even hunger. Yes, there were some black people in the South who prospered after the end of Reconstruction, including as landowners. As Stephen Hahn has noted, by the turn of the 20th century, more than 1 in 5 African American farm operators in the South owned some or all of the soil they tilled, and the proportion was considerably higher in certain parts of the region. Things did not, however, get better for most black people in the South. African Americans all over the nation were dealt a body blow on October 15, 1883, when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875. In the 8-1 decision, it held that Congress could not stop, say, a hotel or a restaurant from discriminating against someone by refusing them a room or a seat at a lunch counter. The majority of justices deemed the Civil Rights Act of 1875 an overreach under the 14th Amendment, holding that it did not extend to discrimination by private businesses. The lone dissenter was Justice John Marshall Harlan, a former Kentucky slaveholder who had become a defender of black civil rights. Frederick Douglass was livid. "We feel it, as we felt the furious attempt years ago to force the accursed system of slavery upon the soil of Kansas," said Frederick Douglass in a speech at a protest rally in Washington, D.C., a week after the court's decision. It was as grievous, said Douglass, as the 1820 Missouri Compromise, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, the 1857 Dred Scott decision. The striking down of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was, charged Douglass, yet one more shocking development of that moral weakness in high places which has attended the conflict between the spirit of liberty and the spirit of slavery from the beginning. In the 1880s, black men continued to vote and continued to serve as office holders, generally in places where black people were in the majority. In 1889, for example, Savannah native John H. DeVoe was made a collector of customs. On the national level, there were still some black men in Congress. Robert Smalls's last term in the House, representing South Carolina, ended in 1887, and three black men, Henry Plummer Cheatham, John Mercer Langston, and Thomas Ezekiel Butler, were elected to the 51st Congress in 1889. But things were not getting better. They became worse when Mississippi held a convention to draft a new state constitution in the summer of 1890. "We came here to exclude the Negro," said the convention's president, S.S. Calhoun, a colonel in the Confederate Army and a future Mississippi Supreme Court justice. Calhoun was talking about going around the intent of the 15th Amendment, about suppressing the black vote in a state where black people were nearly 60% of the population. For one, Mississippi's new constitution called for a would-be voter to pay an annual tax in order to vote. This poll tax of $2 was hardly insignificant at the time, especially given that so many people in Mississippi lived in poverty. Added to the burden of a poll tax, Mississippi's new constitution required that in order for a man to register to vote, he had to pass a literacy test. He had to read a passage of the state constitution and explain it. And the registrar could test a black man with a complicated passage while going easy on a white man with a simple line or two. After Mississippi instituted the poll tax and literacy test in 1890, fewer than 9,000 of the 147,000 voting-age African Americans would be registered to vote by 1892. Other southern states followed Mississippi's lead, with some lawmakers experimenting with what was known as the grandfather clause. People could be exempted from the tough new voting requirements if their grandfathers had been able to vote before the Civil War. By 1910, through legislation or through their constitutions, all former Confederate states had effectively disenfranchised their black citizens. And in suppressing the black vote with the poll tax, states hurt poor white people too. Shameless moral weakness was evident in both high and low places with the rise of the terrorist tactic of lynching black people. These mob murders included hanging people from trees, shooting them in cold blood, and burning them at the stake. Most of the victims were black men and boys, many falsely accused of raping white women. Others were lynched because they had the audacity to hold their ground. That's what happened in March 1892 to three men connected to the People's Grocery in the Curve, a largely black neighborhood on the outskirts of Memphis, Tennessee. The men were Calvin McDowell, manager, William Stewart, a clerk, and the president of the firm that owned the People's Grocery, Thomas Moss. W.H. Barrett, a white grocer in the Curve, resented the People's Grocery's success. He went gunning for the store after a black-white brawl in the Curve in which he participated. The next day, with a police officer in tow, Barrett went to the black grocery store in search of William Stewart, whom he claimed had attacked him the previous evening during that brawl. Barrett ended up knocking Calvin McDowell to the floor with his gun. McDowell got hold of the gun and fired, but didn't hit Barrett or the police officer. McDowell wound up in jail until the following day and faced a fine. But Barrett took the altercation as an opportunity to create legal trouble for his commercial rivals. Mia Bay wrote in her book, To Tell the Truth Freely, The Life of Ida B. Wells. Thanks to Barrett, a grand jury indicted the owners of the People's Grocery for maintaining a public nuisance. The situation deteriorated after Barrett put out a rumor that white people were going to launch an attack on the black grocery store. The People's Grocery hired armed guards, who in a moment of confusion fired on a group of white men who turned out to be deputies, three of whom were wounded. Along with several other black men, McDowell, Stewart, and Moss, who apparently wasn't even on the scene during the shooting, were arrested. Then came a rumor of an impending black uprising. Then came an actual white attack on the People's Grocery. In the wee hours of the morning of March 9, 1892, a white mob snatched McDowell, Stewart, and Moss from jail. They wound up in a desolate field just north of the city limits. We read in To Tell the Truth Freely. There they were lined up for execution at gunpoint. After Moss was dead, at some point, "The mob gouged out his eyes," wrote Bay, before leaving all 3 men stretched out on the ground, partially covered with some brush. Thomas Moss and his wife, Betty, were dear friends of the fearless journalist Ida B. Wells, co-owner of a newspaper in Memphis, Free Speech, and a woman who had sued a railroad after a conductor refused to allow her to sit in a first-class car for which she had a ticket. A lower court ruled in Wells's favor, but then the Tennessee Supreme Court overruled the verdict. "Oh, God," she wrote in her diary after that defeat. "Is there no redress, no peace, no justice in this land for us?" After the murders of McDowell, Stewart, and Moss, Wells embarked on a mission to investigate and raise awareness of lynchings. Even though her life was threatened, even though a white mob destroyed her newspaper's offices, causing her to leave Memphis, she refused to be deterred. In her anti-lynching crusade, Wells produced the pamphlets Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, 1892, and A Red Record, Tabulated Statistics and Alleged Causes of Lynchings in the United States, 1895, with a preface by Frederick Douglass. In slave times, the Negro was kept subservient and submissive by the frequency and severity of the scourging, said Wells in A Red Record. But with freedom, a new system of intimidation came into vogue. The Negro was not only whipped and scourged, he was killed. Wells went on to say, "Not all, nor nearly all of the murders done by white men during the past 30 years in the South have come to light, but the statistics as gathered and preserved by white men, and which have not been questioned, show that during these years more than 10,000 Negroes have been killed in cold blood, without the formality of judicial trial and legal execution." How many white people had been tried and convicted for these lynchings? Wells was only aware of 3. The unstoppable Wells delivered speech after speech on lynchings in the United States, as well as in the British Isles. Between churning out those pamphlets on lynching, Ida B. Wells also collaborated with Frederick Douglass to publish The Reason Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Columbian Exposition, 1893, a stirring rebuke of America's treatment of its black citizens, and a praise song to black strides in the face of egregious racism. The World's Columbian Exposition was the World's Fair held in Chicago in 1893, a grand celebration of the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's discovery of America, one which boasted exhibits from 46 countries. African Americans who had hoped that their achievements and contributions would be on display were sorely disappointed. The fair's organizers wanted no tribute to nor recognition of a people that numbered roughly 7.5 million in 1890, nearly 12% of America's population. The Reason Why, with an introduction by Frederick Douglass, included an essay by Wells on lynching, which, among other things, drove black men from politics. It also included her piece on what she called lynching's twin infamy, the ongoing convict lease system through which prisons, mostly in the South, rented inmates out to plantations, mining companies, and other concerns. "These companies assume charge of the convicts," wrote Wells, "work them as cheap labor, and pay the states a handsome revenue for their labor. 9/10 of these convicts are Negroes." The Reason Why also contained an essay by the black journalist I. Garland Penn on the progress black America had made in the mere 28 years since the abolition of slavery, from patents held by black inventors to trained physicians. With Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells distributed The Reason Why at the fair's Haitian Pavilion, because Douglass, a former U.S. minister-resident and consul general to Haiti, 1889 to 1891, was representing that nation at the World's Columbian Exposition. While Ida B. Wells, following in the tradition of Douglass, pressed for full political rights and civil rights, others urged their people to focus on economic development first. Chief among them was a man who became known as the Wizard of Tuskegee, Booker T. Washington, who rose up from slavery to command the Great Tuskegee Institute, now university, a vocational and teacher training school founded in Tuskegee, Alabama in 1881. Washington became a sensation in 1895 after a speech he delivered before a mostly white crowd on opening day of another fair, the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia. There, on Wednesday, September 18, 1895, 7 months after Frederick Douglass died, Washington advanced his philosophy that black people, the majority of whom still lived in the South, would do best to cast down your bucket where you are. That is, remain where they were and take advantage of opportunities at hand to acquire skills, money, property, and other tangible assets. Cast down your bucket in agriculture, mechanics, in commerce, in domestic service, and in the professions. Washington argued that no people can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. It is at the bottom of life we must begin, and not at the top. At the same time, Washington advised against protesting the prevailing social and political order. He held that, in all things that are purely social, black people and white people can be as separate as the fingers, yet one is the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. That is, economic growth. Washington asserted that the wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly. Political equality would come in time, he maintained, once black people proved themselves hardworking, independent, upstanding members of their communities. This speech, widely praised throughout the South, would be known as the Atlanta Compromise. Booker T. Washington quickly gained the admiration and trust of powerful white philanthropists, including Andrew Carnegie and other industrialists, people who, in turn, made substantial contributions to his school. Roughly 8 months after Booker T. Washington's speech in Atlanta, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down another ruling that devastated African Americans. The case stemmed from Louisiana's 1890 Separate Car Act, which required railroad companies to create equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races. Those who sat in the wrong car would be fined $25 or jailed for up to 20 days. A group of black citizens in New Orleans, many of them with mixed-race backgrounds, the Comité des Citoyens, Committee of Citizens, decided to challenge the Separate Car Act by having one of its members break the law. That member was Homer Adolphe Plessy, a shoemaker who lived in the Treme section of the city. On June 7, 1892, 30-year-old Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black, boarded an East Louisiana Railroad train bound for Covington. With his first-class ticket, Plessy, who could pass for white, took a seat in the whites-only railway car. When the conductor asked him if he was colored, Mr. Plessy replied in the affirmative. When told to leave the whites-only car, he refused. Plessy was eventually removed from the train and jailed, then quickly bailed out by his fellow committee members. Everything had gone as planned. The committee had alerted the railroad of Plessy's intent to ride in a whites-only car. It had even hired the detective who arrested Homer Plessy. His case came before Judge John Ferguson of the District Court of Orleans Parish in November 1892, with the judge ruling against him. The Louisiana Supreme Court upheld that ruling weeks later. Plessy's attorneys appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. On May 18, 1896, the court handed down its decision. It upheld Louisiana's Separate Car Act, thereby upholding racial segregation, reinforcing Jim Crow rule. Jim Crow derived from a grotesque character popularized by white entertainer Thomas Dartmouth "Daddy" Rice in the 1830s. With blackened face and donning tattered clothing, Rice posed as a bumbling fool of a black man, Jim Crow, in song and dance acts. We consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority, wrote Justice Henry Billings Brown in the majority opinion in the Plessy decision. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens, said the lone dissenter. Just as when the Supreme Court struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, that dissenter was Justice John Marshall Harlan. In my opinion, the judgment this day rendered will, in time, prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case, said Harlan. He foresaw that the Plessy decision will not only stimulate aggressions, more or less brutal and irritating, upon the admitted rights of colored citizens, but will encourage the belief that it is possible, by means of state enactments, to defeat the intent, the purposes, of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Separate schools, parks, libraries, hospitals, hotels, restaurants, restrooms, water fountains, waiting rooms, cemeteries. Separate entrances to theaters, courthouses, and other buildings. Separate seating on trolley cars. The U.S. Supreme Court held that there was nothing unconstitutional about racially separate but equal facilities. However, in reality, under Jim Crow, facilities for black people were rarely equal to those for white people. Whereas a town's white children might attend a finely built brick school, its black children might be consigned to a tar paper shack. Whereas white people could travel in well-appointed railroad cars, roomy and with upholstered seats, black passengers on their way to a wedding, a funeral, a vacation, or traveling for work often had to sit on benches in filthy baggage cars, which often doubled as the smoking cars. Justice Brown was dead wrong. Jim Crow most definitely tried to stamp a badge of inferiority permanently on black people, despite all the progress they had made since the end of slavery. It clawed, gouged, hammered at their self-esteem. It cut away at their dignity. At the same time, it reinforced the absurd notion that white people were superior to black people. Jim Crow had millions of African Americans joining Ida B. Wells's lament, "Oh God, is there no redress, no peace, no justice in this land for us?"